starting quite yet, but we're live. All right. Well, welcome to everybody who's joining us online. Just a few instructions before we get started. We're going to wait another minute or so to see if anybody else pops on in. But if you are joining us online, or if you are watching on the YouTube channel, I would invite you, if you're following on the chat, to just go ahead and type in that you're here, your name, and that you're watching. Or if you're watching later, go ahead and go down to the comments on the YouTube and just go ahead and say, hey, we're watching. That helps with just keeping track of how many people are joining together. It's just for statistical. We're not tracking anybody or anything like that, but just trying to keep track of the attendance that we have here at these things. But we're going to give it another minute or so, and then we will get started. And I've got my brand new mug, courtesy of Jim Daniels, for today, and it is just water that I'm drinking, so no other things about that. Alrighty, well, welcome everyone. I am glad to be here with you as we continue on in our study through the scroll of Samuel. And today we're actually going to be getting into the meat of the book. Last week, if you missed, we were basically setting the groundwork and the foundation of the way in which we can read the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Because oftentimes we read the ancient stories of the Bible with a particular lens. We think about our own experiences in reading in other portions of the Bible, or even our own experiences as Westerners, and kind of superimpose that on top of the stories. And what I encouraged us last week is to try not to do that, to actually think about the historical context in which we're reading everything, because I think there's a great depth within the pages of 1st and 2nd Samuel that we leave on the cutting room floor if we aren't taking these things into account. And so we're going to pray here in a second, then I just kind of want to open it up because I hope that you had the chance to read chapters 1 through 7, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, and we'll kind of cover that as we go. But before we get started, is there anyone who'd be willing to open us up in a word of prayer tonight? Thank you. Well, like I said, I hope that you had a chance of reading chapters 1 through 7. And what I wanted to do as we get started is just kind of open it up to you all. You've been reading and hopefully sitting with this text a little bit. And again, I would encourage you not to just read it one time, but to read it a few times throughout the week. We'll never have more than a couple of chapters that we're reading, enough that you could, in theory, do it in one sitting. And so I encourage you to try to read it in one sitting, and then sit with it. Think about it, reflect on the parts that jump out, reread it again, and see what else pops out. But as you were reading through this, and especially in consideration of what we talked about last week, was there anything that jumped out at you as particularly interesting, or confusing, or disheartening, or encouraging, or anything that you felt while reading through these chapters? And if not, that's okay. We'll find you something today. You're talking about Hannah? Yeah, the emotional strength it would take to wait and pray all of these years for a child only to give him up at the age of, what, 3, after he's been weaned, would take, you're right, a tremendous amount of fortitude. Other things. Well, like I said, we'll find something for you as we work through. Um, Now, in other weeks, we might do some jumping around because I think that it's important for us to consider certain parts of the narrative together. And this is indeed a narrative. Even though we are in the books of history and we are reading history, the way that ancient people wrote history is very different than the way that we write history today. Whenever a history book is written today, there is a lot of care taken to making sure that the facts are as unbiased as possible, that we are just remitting exactly what happened. Good history today isn't trying to push a particular agenda or a particular narrative or trying to make one party look better than the other. Those are all very modern constructions about history. That is not how ancient histories were made. Even in the time of Jesus, when we think about the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, that's actually a history that was essentially bought. Theophilus put together and paid for Luke to put together a history of the person of Jesus and of the early church. And that's how histories were often made, is someone would pay someone to collect data and then create a story, usually for the sake of making the person who's paying for the writing of the history to look the best that they possibly can. And so this idea of histories being nonpartisan, for lack of a better word, is very, 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 very new. Now, what is interesting about Israelite history is where other nations and other kings and rulers will have histories constructed, they are always there to make themselves look the best that they can. So, for example, there is a stele in Egypt talking about the invasion of what they called the Sea Peoples. And even though our archaeological evidence shows that they actually did a number on the Egyptians, it's just about how the king was awesome and the best, and the Pharaoh was able to drive the people, and their peoples are no more, and we cast them into the sea, and no one is as great as this Pharaoh, right? And so none of the bad parts show up in the official documents of the kingdom, because, of course, if you're the king, then you want to make yourself look the best. What is interesting about Israelite history is that we actually have some of the worst stories of the leaders. And that's because as these histories were developing, it was a conglomeration of both the Israelite people wanting to share the narrative not of them as a people, but of Yahweh, their God, and how God was interacting in the world, along with the work of prophets like Nathan, like Samuel, like some of these other people that are often antagonists to the kings in the story. And so you have these different movements within the Israelite people creating what we're reading on the pages today. But that isn't to say that this isn't coming from just out of nowhere. There are particular agendas put into this, and that's why it reads more like a narrative. We're not getting all of the facts. We're not getting all of the details. Like, you can read a history of the Battle of Gettysburg, and you know exactly how many men are in each division and where they were on each day, and you can get down into the very minute details, including the lists of names of people in that if you really wanted to. We don't get that because those details weren't important to the story that the authors were trying to tell. So the question is, well, what is the story that the authors are trying to tell when the scroll of Samuel was written? And to answer that, we actually just turn to the first 2 chapters. So we have a very interesting time, because if you think about the story of Samuel, or the scroll of Samuel, so remember that's 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel together, how much time does Samuel actually get in the book? in 1st and 2nd Samuel, how much time does Samuel actually get? Well, none. He's dead by then. Right? He's really only in the first 15 chapters. That's it. So, of this entire scroll named Samuel, the actual person of Samuel is only in the first quarter, maybe, right? And that's mixed in with a whole bunch of other characters, because, like, Samuel is there, but he's not doing a whole lot until, like, chapter 4, right? So, that's an interesting thing to note right off the bat, is the namesake of the book doesn't have a very long portion of the story. So the question is, well, why might that be? And why do we start with Samuel at all? Because we do indeed start with Samuel. If you pick up, again, if you were just reading through the Bible, Ruth happens during the time of Judges, but remember, we're going essentially from the book of Judges into the book of 1 Samuel, right? So, we just ended the book of Judges with that phrase, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then we pick up this. There was a certain man of Ramathim, a Zuphite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jerome, son of Elihud, son of Tuah, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. So we have the whole story of Peninnah doing what? Being mean. Beth, how is she being mean? Why? Right. So why? No, but why would Peninnah do that? Ah, so we have a husband who loves one wife more than the other, but one is not able to have children, and it causes one of the wives to mistreat the barren child or barren wife. Does that sound familiar? Where does that sound familiar from? What? Right. Yes, with Leah and Rachel. Leah, sorry. I always want to say Leah. This is your shirt. I looked at your shirt. We remember the story of the beginning of the 12 tribes, right? We have 2 wives. One is loved and one is not. And it leads to a whole lot of family bickering. So whenever a Hebrew is hearing and writing this, these stories are not lost, right? This is all part of the Jewish narrative of who they are. And so it's very interesting that we get these particular details. Because if you think about it, why do we need to know any of this stuff? Do we need to know that Peninnah is making fun of Hannah? Do we even need to know that Peninnah exists at all? Is that relevant to the story? Maybe in the fact that Hannah is upset, right? But it just as easily could have been that she was upset because she didn't have any children. That's a very reasonable thing, right? If you're year after year not able to have children. So why include that detail? Now, there aren't necessarily straightforward answers to that, but as we read through the book of 1 Samuel, that should be a question anytime you read anything is, why do we have this, or why don't we have this, right? So you'll read lots of times, like, especially when I work with kids, it'll be like, Pastor Nate, why didn't they say X, Y, Z, or why didn't they X have such and such, right? And the answer is, well, I don't know why they didn't include some things, but we can talk about why they did include some things. And so right off the bat, we have a history that's actually pulling back to the very beginning of the Israelite people. Remember, we're coming from Judges. Are the Israelite people acting like the people of Israel? No, they're not, right? They are acting like 12 separate tribes that are willing to kill each other off for whatever reason, right? They do not get along. Kind of like the 12 sons of Jacob. If you remember the story of Joseph, where they were pretty much ready to kill off one of their brothers because he was a brat. As the oldest sibling, I can relate, but so we had family issues that grew into much bigger problems. And in the book of Judges, we see that those problems haven't really abated, even in these hundreds of years, even as they've kind of come forward as their own people, these old family rivalries are still embedded there. And so our story begins with a callback to that and say, hey, remember that story? Remember the judges? Remember how everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes? Yeah, that hasn't stopped just because we've changed books. So we have Hannah going into the temple, or not the temple, into the tabernacle. Where is the tabernacle at this point? At Shiloh, which we said is, turn this on. Oh, it buzzes. Cool. Is right here in the center of Israel, in the hill country of Ephraim, right there. So that's where the tabernacle is, and we're introduced to a man named Eli. Is Eli a good guy? Yes? All right, we've got one yes. Got some other nods. All right, that's enough for me to take a poll. If you think that Eli was a good guy, raise your hands. If you think that Eli was a bad guy, raise your hands. If you think that Pastor Nate's trying to trap you with these polls, raise your hands. There you go. That's what I love to see. We don't know yet. We just know that he is the one who is serving in the tabernacle, and he seems to be the guy in charge. Now we also know that his two sons are scoundrels, right? Why are they scoundrels? That's correct. So they were taking extra portions of the sacrifices. So the way the Levites and the priests were not allotted any land. If you look up here, you'll notice that there is no Levi up here. Why is that? Right, they didn't get a portion of the land. They were given particular cities, but what was their portion? Right, but within the, like, how do you live if you're a priest? And how did they support you? Did they just bring you food? That's right. They actually got a portion of the sacrifices. So if I come and I'm going to sacrifice my goat as a sacrifice to God, I'm going to bring it. We're going to bring it alive. We're going to slaughter it there. We're going to drain all of its blood. We're going to cut out all of its innards, and we're going to separate it out. And certain parts are going to be burned as sacrifice. Certain parts are going to be cut up and given to the priests. And the rest I get to eat with my family, because this is a really expensive offering. If you think about how much goats and cattle and all of that were worth at this point in history, to kill something means, one, you don't get any more milk from it, right? Two, you can't mate it with anything else, and so it's the end of that bloodline, as it were, with that particular animal. And so meat was usually reserved for either the incredibly wealthy or those who were offering sacrifices. And so what Phineas and his brother would do is they would go, and instead of following the customs of just sticking in and basically random chance out of a boiling pot and seeing what you get, that way it's more fair, instead they were going and saying, hey, before you even start cooking anything, give us just some raw meat so that we can cook it how we want, which anyone who's eaten boiled meat as opposed to a grilled steak knows how much better grilled steaks are, right? And so not only were they doing that, but they were also doing it before the fatty parts, the best parts, were burned up. Why is that a problem? That's right. So by taking the best parts before they were burned up, who were they stealing from? So we have in the same instance, they're stealing from the people because they're saying we don't want random chance by sticking into the pot and getting what we get. which sometimes means we get a big part, but a lot of times it means that the family, whoever's bringing the meat, gets to do it. Instead, we're saying, no, just give us a chunk before. We want chance out of it. We want our portion. So they're not only stealing from the people, but they're also stealing from God himself and saying, no, our appetites are more important than sacrifices to Yahweh. Does that surprise you at all? It shouldn't, based on everything we just read in the book of Judges, right? What else were they doing? Sleeping with the women who were serving at the tents of meeting. Why? I know that sounds like a silly question. But why just those women? Because after all, these were important people, right? The fact that they could get away with literally robbing people and robbing God and sleeping with women in the tents. Why those people? Why those women in particular? Well, we don't know for sure, but we do know that temple and cultic prostitution was a very, very common thing in the land of Israel at this time. In fact, there were women whose jobs it was to just be in the temple to sleep with men as a ritual act of engaging with the divine. And so you would come in, and by the way, if we're watching online and children are watching, this is where we're going to get graphics, so maybe turn down the volume. But literally, you would go and sleep, and through orgasm and through the chemical processes in your brain, it would be a means to an end, a means of connecting with divinity in that way. And that was all over the place. And so there are some strong inclinations here that the women who are there, it's not just that they were taking advantage of their position, but that there was actually cultic prostitution happening in the tabernacle in Israel. Why? Well, because we just read Judges. What were the people doing? They were assimilating all of the worship of the gods around them, and they were creating particular modes of worship that weren't in line with what Yahweh had told them, but was in line with how everyone else did worship around them. Okay? So, we have these terrible people, and we have their father, who we think is a good guy, but some of you weren't sure, and most of you thought I was walking you into a trap. So let's talk about that. So we have a few instances of Eli. Why would we say that Eli was a good guy? Understanding that good is a very relative term, so I understand we're a little loosey-goosey with our terms. But why might we consider Eli a good guy? Okay, because of his position. Say more about that. Okay, so at some point, because there are lots of other people who could have had this job, he somehow worked up his ranks to be in charge of things. And so that says something about him as a person, right? Now, do you still hold that answer if we're thinking about maybe the worship of Yahweh being tainted in a little bit? Does that shift your perception of Eli in being that top dog? Not sure? Maybe? We don't know. We don't know the details. And everything that I said about sleeping with women, that very well could have just been people serving and the two brothers taking advantage of their position and power. So don't get me wrong. We could be reading things in here. We're not given those details. But I'm just trying to put us in the broader context of other things that we've read in Judges, as well as other things that we know were going on in the land of Israel. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's usually whenever we think about Eli, that's usually the only story we actually think about is Samuel getting woken up in the middle of the night and hearing God's voice, and Eli getting annoyed at him for waking him up in the middle of the night, until Eli finally recognizes that he's having a divine experience and saying, all right, this is how you should respond. And if that was the only story of Eli, then it could point to that. But also, remember, we had the story of the other diviners that were going on among the Philistines that were trying to figure out how they should respond to the ark, which we'll get to in a little bit. And even they recognized Yahweh as being divine and the need to act in particular ways when dealing with Yahweh. So it could be that he was wise in understanding that, or it could be that he just had an understanding of the particular cults and what the right phrases ought to be, whether or not he had those experiences himself. But yeah, if we only had that, I would agree that, yeah, I think we would be inclined to say that he was a pretty upright dude, even though he might have had some terrible sons. But as we read, let us turn to chapter 2, verse 22. Now Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons were doing to all of Israel, and how they lay with women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And he said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from these people. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If one person sins against another, someone can intercede for the sinner with the judge. But if someone else sins against the Lord, who can make intercession?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to kill them. So again, another point in the Eli's a good guy camp, because it seems like he recognizes the evil of his son and he's trying to stop them, right? Now, we don't know why he's trying to stop them. Upon first reading, it looks like the reason he's trying to stop them is because their reputation is being harmed. But we'll give him the benefit of the doubt this first time. But we're going to keep reading. A man of God came to Eli and said to him, Thus the Lord has said, I revealed myself to the family of your ancestors in Egypt when they were slaves to the house of Pharaoh. So again, remember how we talked about anytime the Lord talks about himself, he calls back to Egypt and says, I'm that same God? Because again, the people at this time were polytheistic, worshiping plenty of other gods. And so God has to be very careful to say, this is who I am, and this is my relationship to you. I chose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, talking about Eli's ancestor, and to go up to my altar to offer incense and to wear the ephod before me. And I gave to the family of your ancestor all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then look with greedy eye at my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded, and honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of the offerings of my people Israel? So, we have here the Lord talking to Eli. And is Eli having a problem with the practice of his son stealing stuff from the Lord? Not only is he not doing anything about it, but notice what the Lord says. You honor your sons more than me. How? By fattening who? Yourselves. Not just your sons, but who else is getting fat? And how is he getting fat? He's getting a cut of what his sons are doing. You don't get fat in the ancient world unless you are very rich or you're taken from somebody else. And in fact, we find that to be true if we go to the end of Eli's story. In chapter 4, we will go down to verse 17. So the ark has been captured, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the messenger replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the troops. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backwards from his seat. by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and fat. So I think it's pretty clear from putting these different portions together that Eli is not the greatest guy that we often make him out to be if we're just reading the story of Samuel at night. What we have is a leader who has either was corrupt, and that's how he rose to the rank that he is, or has become corrupted because of his sons and not willing to keep them in line, such that he now is complicit in robbing God. All right? So we have Hannah and Eli. And Hannah comes to the temple of God and is busy praying there, crying out to the Lord. And what does Eli think Eli thinks that she's drunk, right? Because she's sitting there, she's praying, she's moving her mouth, but she's not saying anything out loud. Which, did that strike anybody as weird? Why? That's the best answer I've ever heard. Usually if you're drunk, you're loud. Okay, that might be the case, but why else did that strike anybody as weird? Because people go to the temple to pray, or at least they do in our own minds, right? Have you ever read the instructions on like a mundane object and it has like really weird warnings? And if you've said to yourself, the only reason that is a warning is because some stupid idiot tried to do that. You ever thought that? I think this is one of those times in the scriptures is it's weird to us because we think of the temple as like, this church. And if in our culture, if you showed up to church drunk, then like you probably would be shamed for doing so. But remember, we are not talking about the Western world. And imbibing in a lot of drink was very, very common in cultic practices around the land of Israel. And so you had cultic prostitutes, and you had illicit drugs, and you had lots and lots of wine. All of these things that would kind of make you feel outside of your body so that you can engage with the divine, right? That was all over the place. And so maybe it's not the most weird thing that someone would come in and be drunk in the tabernacle or in those areas. It could very well be the case that that was a common thing, that Eli was constantly having to kick drunk people out of the tabernacle because people were doing that. Now, we don't know for sure, but we do know that that was a common practice all around. And we know that the people of Israel adopted a lot of those customs and worshiped other gods. And there is no centralized religion or real religious practice in Israel at this time. And so although we don't know this for sure, these are the things to be keeping in the back of your mind as we read those stories. It's like, why is that weird to us? Well, would that have been weird at the time? But we know that Hannah wasn't indeed drunk. She was fervently in prayer. And the Lord spoke through Eli, the guy that we know is actively stealing from God. God still speaks through him and says that, don't worry, God has heard your prayers and is going to answer you. And so we get in chapter 2 a summary of the entire book of Samuel. So remember how last week I said that there's that one section in Judges that is basically a summary of all of Judges? And it was a summary because it told all of the things that happened. In chapter 2, it's a summary, but not of all of the things that are going to happen, but of the main theme of what the scroll of Samuel is all about. And so I want to read it in its entirety. This is essentially the prologue, the introduction about what this history is about, what the story is going to be about. And so this is chapter 2, verse 1. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no Holy One like the Lord, no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. And no, I can't read that without singing the song, Thanks, Beth, from TCE last year. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low, he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might does one prevail. The Lord, his adversaries shall be shattered. The Most High will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth and will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. So we have this beautiful prayer or hymn that Hannah has, and it is giving us the rubric for how we're going to read the rest of the scroll of Samuel. So, having said that, what are some of the main themes that we're going to be paying attention to through the rest of the book? Just based on what we just read in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. What? The sovereignty of God. So that God is over everything, that it is by him that actions are weighed, and so he becomes the measuring stick for how people act and what is considered good and what is considered bad. It is the Lord who decides that. And not only that, but it is the Lord who is the mover and shaker and worker in history. The Lord's adversaries will be shattered, right, and scattered abroad. He is able to do all of these amazing things. So yes, the sovereignty of God working in the midst of history is one of them, one of the main themes. What else is there? What? Yeah, a lot of fighting and a lot of God working through battles to bring about his ends, right? So that's wrapped up in the sovereignty of God. What other main themes do you see in there? But there is one God, right? That all of these other gods, this polytheistic culture is bunk, right? There is Yahweh, and Yahweh is the one who is sovereign over everything. Right? So that's, again, wrapped up in the sovereignty of God. Yeah.
He protects the faithful.
Not just the faithful, but who else? The lowly, the needy, the poor, those who are in humble places, right? And who does God not protect? The wicked? Those who are in opposition to God? Who else? Let's look at verse 3. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. So the proud, the arrogant, the bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low, he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts up the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit the seats of honor. And so we have this very interesting dichotomy. So the first premise is that God is sovereign over everything, and that God is going to achieve what he wants in the world because he's the one, he is God. But in doing so, he has chosen to do two things. For those who are humble and obedient, whether they are needy or poor or weak, God is going to raise them up. The weak he's going to strengthen, the poor he's going to fatten, the feeble he's going to, and the poor he's going to enrich, right? But those who are arrogant, those who are haughty, those who speak more highly of themselves, those who are proud and wicked, what is the Lord going to do? He's going to bring them low, right? And he's going to humble them. He's going to do this, right? That is the theme of the entire book of Samuel. That God is sovereign, that he brings low the haughty, and he raises up the humble. And we know this is the case because we're given a case study with Eli and his sons, right? The next 5 chapters are, well, we're given Eli and his sons who are wicked and haughty and arrogant and choose themselves over God's plan. And so what does God do? He kills them. No, he doesn't just kill them. He kills off Hophni and Phinehas, right? So they're dead. What else does he do? He curses. Oh, go ahead. Exactly. He curses the entire family for all generations. He literally says, good times are coming for Israel, but your entire family is not going to enjoy them because they're all going to die young. That's pretty brutal. But that's exactly what the Lord does. And he does that in a very interesting way. In fact, we have 2 simultaneous stories that are showing how Hannah's prayer is true. So we're given this prophecy by one of the men of God to Eli, and he says, I'm going to curse your family, and this is how you know it's going to be true. Both of your sons are going to die on the same day. All right? So, we have this curse and prophecy, which, by the way, is a great way to start any story with curses and prophecy, right? But then we have the family of Eli and his sons, but then we have the larger nation of Israel. And we have 2 stories that kind of merge together. So we are told in chapter 4, and I'm skipping over the call of Samuel, mostly because we all know that story pretty well. But in chapter 4, it says that the Philistines gathered up to fight against Israel. So the Philistines are the people who live down here along the coast. They were most likely sea people who came across during the Bronze Age collapse, probably from Greece. They were probably Mycenaean Greeks that were, or Proto-Greeks that were coming from over here. We're not entirely sure where they came from, but they're there. In the story, they become some of the main antagonists for the Israelites. And if you remember from our study of the geography of the Holy Lands, along the coast is nice, flat, open area. And here in the middle of Israel, next to the Dead Sea and Jordan, there is high mountains. And in between, there's kind of rolling foothills called the Shephelah. And that's where the Israelites and the Philistines often fought, because the Philistines were always worried about the Israelites because they're up in the mountains, and anytime they can come down and ambush you and attack you and take all your stuff. And the Israelites were always worried about the Philistines because they were always trying to push up and grab cities and fortresses in the foothills, trying to climb their way up into the mountains. And so they were gathering and fighting, and the Israelites, because there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eye, had the bright idea of saying, well, we can bring our holy relic into battle with us, and that will guarantee us victory. Why? Well, because wars in the ancient world weren't just battles of flesh and blood, but they were literally gods fighting each other. And so the Israelites said, well, if our battles are gods fighting each other, if we bring our holy relic into battle, that will force the hand of our God, because our God wouldn't let the most holy of relics lose and be lost in battle. And so we can force the hand of God into giving us victory by bringing this into battle with us. And that's exactly what they do. They think that they can control the hand of the sovereign God and basically steal a victory. Now, given what we just read in chapter 2, would you say that that is going to give them victory or defeat? If what Hannah says is true, that would be what we would assume. And that's indeed what we do get. That Yahweh actually allows his own people to lose and to be killed, killing Phinehas and Hophni in the process, and allow the holy relic to be taken away as plunder into the hands of Israel's enemies. Now, that is a crazy start to a story, that Yahweh would allow essentially his name to be humbled, because by doing that, what is he saying to the rest of the world? That Yahweh is not as powerful as Dagon. That Dagon won the victory, and that Yahweh, even with his holy relic, wasn't as powerful. Now, is that actually what happened? No, because we know as outside observers that Yahweh easily could have won the battle for the Israelites. But we know that God is sovereign. And so we have the next 2 chapters of God allowing things to happen that even make him look bad and his people to suffer in order to achieve his broader goals. And so we have the wonderful story of the Ark of the Covenant being put into the temple of Dagon, and what happens? Not just a statue. What is a statue? But it's not just a statue. What is it? It's an idol, right? It's the idol that people would come and worship in the temple. And it falls on its face, right? And they're like, well, that's probably not a good sign. But they put it back up, and the next day they come in, what happened? Not only did it fall over, but it was beheaded and its arms were cut off, right? And then what happened? Right, the people were afflicted with tumors, and the Septuagint also has rats in the city. To the point where there were so many people dying that the people of, I think it started in Ekron, is that right? No, it ended in Ekron. Ashdod. The people of Ashdod were like, all right, there's obviously something going on. We need to move this relic. And so they send it to Gath, right? And what happens in Gath? Right, the same thing. The hand of the Lord is heavy and people are dying in droves, right? Now, again, because we're reading all one story here, why is Gath important? Who else do we know was from Gath? Who? Goliath from Gath, right? Who would have been born when? Roughly about the time of Samuel, because he was a warrior, or somewhere in that time. He was probably a little bit younger than Samuel, because Samuel was an older man by the time of David and Goliath. But maybe just one generation removed. Now, I'm not making a point about that, but again, I'm just helping us to think about timeline and about places. So this is probably happening to Goliath's parents, which, by the way, I don't know if tumors affected anything, but we do have a generation of people affected by tumors and rats, and then you have crazy, freakish giants in the next generation. I'm not drawing any conclusions there, but it is interesting to think about. This is what I spend my time thinking about. Yeah, that's exactly. And so you have this experience in Gath, and then Ekron, and finally the Philistines are like, clearly something is going wrong, that this God Yahweh still has power in this region. Even though we defeated him and his armies, Something has gone wrong that he's still affecting us and cursing us with this. And so we need to send it back. And so they send the ark back with a peace offering or an offering to Yahweh. Now, again, think about that. We have Philistines who are making sacrifices to Yahweh in order to be at peace with Yahweh. So the ark comes back with the gold offerings. What are the gold offerings? Yeah, so they make little sculptures of golden tumors and rats, which, by the way, is a wonderful Bible trivia question. But if you ever do a travel trivia night, I will definitely bring that one out. So, and they send it back, and the hand is lifted from the Philistines, and it goes back to the Israelites. And it's a happy day, right? Because the ark is back where it belongs with the people of God. And everybody lives happily ever after, right? Because where does it go to? Went to the town of Beit Shemesh, which again, it's kind of hard to see, but it's all right in here. We're talking about an area of like 20 miles for all of these stories. Like, this is not, it's like between us and Worcester that the ark is traveling, all right? And the people of Beit Shemesh are happy to receive the ark, and they keep it there, and everybody lives happily ever after, right? No, what happens? They looked inside the ark, and what did God do? It does say 70 of them. Some other sources, again, this is because we have lots of different scraps of paper from around this time trying to figure out what originally was there. Some sources have 70, and some sources have 10,070. A little bit of a difference. But regardless, the hand of the Lord is heavy upon who? The Israelite people. And so we're given a juxtaposition of the Philistines versus the people of God, and they're getting the exact same treatment. Why? Because they're being arrogant. The Philistines were being arrogant by saying, oh, we've won victory over Yahweh, and we can put his holy relic in the temple of our God and show him off as a booty prize, right? And God says, no, I'm the sovereign Lord, and I get to say what happens. And then they send it back to Israel, and the Israelites are arrogant and say, hey, we've got our relic back. I've always wondered what was in that thing. Let's check it out. And the Lord says, no, no, no. This is my holy relic. You don't get to just act how you want, and so my hand is going to be heavy upon you. And so the people of Shemesh are wiped out, whether it's 70 or a lot. My guess is it's probably 70, and 70 was a lot. This is another thing that we're going to get into, is the population of the land of Israel is much, much smaller than you think in your head. So when we think of cities, we think of like Shreve maybe, or Worcester, because those are cities in our head. The largest city at this time in the land of Israel was Lachish, which is right here. And how big do you think the city of Lachish was in the city and the surrounding area as far as population? Biggest city in this entire country, in the entire region. How big? Any guesses? 15,000? Too high. A little bit bigger than that. Between 8 and 10,000 was the upper limit of the biggest city. Which means we have all these little podunk towns that are not big cities that probably have less than 1,000 people in them. And so if you have less than 1,000 people and 70 people are killed off, that's like almost 10% of your entire town who's died. So that would be like if 110 people, or no, Shreve is like, what, 1,500? Yeah, so it'd be like 150 people just died tonight in the town of Shreve. Do you think that would have an effect on us here? Yeah, maybe a little bit, right? So, whether it's 10,000, I think that's probably unlikely. I think 70 is the more accurate number. It's still a big amount for this town. And so they send it off to the next town up, Kiriath Jearim. And does it stay there? Yeah, for a long time. For 20 years, it stays there. And so again, think about that. We usually think about the tabernacle and the ark being like a place and center of worship. But here we have the ark just chilling in some guy's house in some backwater town in Israel. Does that sound like a unified religious practice to you? Does that sound like everybody in Israel is on the same page about following the Torah? No, it does not. Well, hold on. I've got 5 minutes, and then we'll do that. So put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it. And so we have these two back-to-back stories that are there. They are there to tell history, but I think more importantly, this is the prologue to what we're going to read in the rest of the book with the kingship. Because you'll notice, how does Hannah's prayer end in chapter 2? It is prophetic. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and to exalt the power of his anointed. By the way, how would we translate his anointed in Hebrew? Messiah. Right, so we, as both later Jews and in particular later Christians read this, and we read this as prediction, not just of the kingship that was going to be established, but of Jesus himself, which is also one of the reasons, if you read in Luke chapter 2, Mary has a song right after she's visited by Gabriel, and if you read through, the exact same things, and some of even the same language, is there between Hannah's prayer and Mary's hymn in Luke chapter 2. If you've never done that before, I encourage you to go home and read those two side by side. But we have this prophetic vision about a king. And so right here at the beginning, we're told that what is this story of? Well, it is the story of kings in Israel. But we don't actually get to kings in Israel until chapter 8. And so this prologue is to back up that, yes, chapter 2 is what it is all about. That God is sovereign and that he works in history. And sometimes he even allows his name to be thrown in the mud to achieve his broader goals. And his broader goals are to make humble the proud and to raise up the humble. And it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you are the priests. It doesn't matter if you are the people of God. It doesn't matter if you are Philistines and foreigners. Everyone is held to this same code. If you are arrogant and proud, the Lord will crush you. And if you are humble and obedient, the Lord will raise you up. And we're spending an entire day on just this because we're going to come back to this every single week for the next 6 weeks, because the entire book is about this. And every story we have with Saul and with David is going to be judged by chapter 2. And we're going to see that time and time and time again with Saul and David, both living in accordance with this and being raised up, and also living against what God says and being humbled in the midst of that. And so, if you haven't already, again, read through, and I would even try to memorize this, because this first part of chapter 2 will be the most important aspect of the entire portion that we read in the book of Samuel. Okay? All right. Yes, going back to your question. Oh boy.
The ark gets captured.
Mm-hmm.
So while it's captured, there's an empty tabernacle in Shiloh.
Yep.
And then so how much time gets passed? And if we're only talking about like a small geographic area, wouldn't they make an effort to get the ark back into the tabernacle?
They might.
So the tabernacle has all of the, it's a tent structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it also has like all of the stuff that come along with it.
Exactly. So if you remember from the book of Exodus, it's all of the utensils and the big basins and the braziers and all of those things.
So wouldn't all the Levites at Shiloh be wanting to have that ark back? Was it like a power struggle, like a power thing
Mm-hmm.
that they were
So that's an excellent question, and I think it does get into this idea of how fractured the Israelite people were. So first of all, one thing that we need to make clear is when it says that the Israelites went up for battle, does it mean all of Israel? We read it like, oh yeah, we're a cohesive unit and everybody sent their fighting men to fight. But the reality is that is almost never the case when we read Israel went up for battle. What we're probably talking about is a tribe, or maybe one or two or maybe three tribes that have joined together to fight a common threat. But do you think the people of Dan were coming down and fighting down here in Ephraim against the Philistines? Do they care? Probably not. Not that much. The people down in Simeon care that much? Maybe a little, but not that much. Certainly the people of Gad and Manasseh and Reuben do not care. They've got a whole river in between them and the Philistines. They probably didn't even know about it until long after it happened. So, when we're talking about Israelites coming together and fighting, we're probably just talking about a couple of tribes together. On top of that, remember how we talked about last week about the prestige that may come by having the tabernacle or the Ark of the Covenant or these other religious artifacts in your particular tribe's territory? Well, we actually have in here, you'll notice, it gets kind of congested as far as colors go, right? You've got Dan, even though they're up north because they got booted out, but you've got Ephraim, you've got Benjamin, you've got Manasseh, and you've got Judah, all in this very small area, again, between us and Worcester. It's a very, very small area. And so, it comes down here to Gath and Ekron and comes up. The city of Kiriath Jearim is actually in Judah, I think. And so it went from Ephraim. It was lost in a battle most likely fought by Ephraimites and maybe some people from Manasseh and Benjamin. And then it worked its way back down into Judah. Would Judah want to necessarily give that up? Judah had Levites. You're right, but did the Levites travel around? Remember our story of Micah and the Levite from the book of Judges? And the Levites saying, oh yeah, I'll serve this tribe or this person if they give me like a decent amount of money. And so again, we have this image of, oh, well, the Levites are the priests, and so of course they're good people. But we have Eli and Phinehas and Hophni who clearly prove that they are not necessarily that, and they weren't thrown out of power either. We're talking about broken human beings, many of whom are just out for survival or out for their own benefit. And so it very well could have been that the ark stayed in Kiriath and that the rest of the tabernacle stayed at Shiloh. So you actually had different places of worship or different kinds of worship or different kinds of sacrifice. It's almost like there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, we don't know the exact details. Was the rest of the stuff moved down there? We just don't know. But we do know that the ark stayed in this town. But that's a really good question. It gets to that point of, I can't even make an educated guess because it's such a stinking mess with the tribes of Israel. Yes, other questions? Steve? Mm-hmm. Well, and those are the details that were not given. And remember, it's important to think about the details that we are given. Why have we been told this? And why haven't we been told other things? And so we haven't been given a lot of details about the ark or about what's going on. Why do you think that's the case? Again, this becomes one of the most important things in Israelite worship, right? But I want you to think about, given everything that we've just read in chapter 2, why do you think we haven't been given those details? Because what is? Remember, we've got three things that are our themes from chapter 2. What's the first theme? That God is sovereign. Is God bound to his holy relics? Is God bound to his tabernacle? Is God even bound to his people? No, because God is sovereign. And so we have these things that would normally be the focal points of any story, right? Like the tabernacle, the holy relics for offering sacrifices, the Ark of the Covenant, the people of God. And our beginning introduction says, nope. What's important is that God does what he wants, and he makes the things happen that he wants to happen, regardless of who's working with him. Now, if people do work with him and humble themselves before the Lord, he raises them up. And if you work against him and fight against him and are arrogant, he'll level you. But God is the mover and shaker. And that gets to kind of my final point for tonight. Do we serve a different God? No. Has God changed since the writing of these stories? Oh, so we still serve a sovereign God who still brings down the prideful and the arrogant and the wicked and raises up the humble and the obedient. Is our God bound by holy relics today? Well, we don't really have holy relics per se, but is he bound by denominations? Is he bound by even the church? Is the church safe if we start acting arrogantly and wickedly from the heavy hand of the Lord? Is the pastor safe if he acts arrogantly and wickedly from the heavy hand of the Lord? Are people outside of the church who humble themselves and are obedient, are they excluded from the Lord raising up and exalting them? I would say no. And that's good news, I think. It's good news because we've been given the information we need to obey the Lord. We happen to live in a really wonderful time where we have all of these wonderful stories, or we have people that we can learn from, and to have it more clear of just exactly what the Lord wants. But it's also bad news because we happen to live in an age where I think human pride is exceptional. Because we do all of these wonderful things, and we live in a very humanist society that says human beings are the end-all, be-all. And it's very hard to guard against that, even if we know it's not true. And so my encouragement for us as a church and for us as a study as we work through these pages is that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is still our God. And that we are given a choice as well. Are we going to be arrogant and haughty and think that we can do things on our own, or think that we can manipulate God into doing what we want? Well, if you do, let me know how it works out for you. Or are we going to be a people that says we're going to humble ourselves? What the Lord says within these pages, we're going to obey. Regardless of what happens around us, we're going to be at peace, trusting that God is at work. This is something that I've been wrestling with. We're going to talk about more on Sunday mornings as we go through the book of Job. But we have a very consequential election coming up, don't we? Do you think any of this applies to our election? Do you think that God is sovereign over that? If your candidate doesn't get elected, was God still sovereign over that? See, these are the questions that are sometimes difficult to answer because we know the right answer, but our heart might not be in that same place either. Mm-hmm. And again, we will be talking more about this. The book of Job gets into a lot of the details of what do we do when it is hard to explain, right? But I find this as a source of comfort as we work through these hard times of saying, no, God is still sovereign. It's the same God. It's the same God that is at work. Now, sometimes it stinks to be with the people that are haughty and arrogant because you might have the hand of the Lord heavy upon you whether you were engaged or not. But at the end, God works what he will. And all we can do is decide with what we're going to do with the time that he's allotted to us. And so it's my prayer that as we continue working through this, that we will learn from the mistakes, but we'll keep coming back to chapter 2. And each day we will wake up and say, all right, am I going to humble myself before the Lord and do what he wants and trust in his sovereignty? Or am I going to be arrogant and try to forge my own path and try to figure out what will be good for me and for my kin as opposed to what the Lord has for me? It's my prayer that we will choose humility in the midst of all of that. Now, I know we had at least one other question. That's kind of the end of this portion for us. But one final question? Okay. We have gone a little bit over, and so I apologize for that. We had a lot to cover because, again, this is, building the foundation of the things we're going to keep coming back to. But for next week, we are going to read about the story of Saul. And so I'm going to invite you to read chapters 8 through 15. Chapters 8 through 15. And again, as you read, please read more than once. It's only 7 chapters. It's like 5 pages. And so if you can read it all in one sitting, I encourage you to do that because you get to see the flow of the narrative and the story when you do that. It also gives you opportunity to read multiple times in multiple sessions the same story. But pay attention to the things that we've talked about what we know that the tribes are all over the place, what we know about worship, what we know about warfare, what we know about the political situation as you read through these, and what we know the story is about in chapter 2. In fact, I would encourage you to just read Hannah's prayer before you read any of the sections that we're going to, so that it's always in the forefront of your mind. And then, circle the things that pop out because of what we've said, particularly with Hannah's prayer. Because that's what we're going to keep coming back to. Because again, it is just a recycling of this narrative the whole way through the book of Samuel. Okay? So, and as always, if you have questions or concerns, stop in at the office, talk with me, send me an email, give me a call. I love talking about this stuff. I love when I don't know the answer because it gives me an opportunity to go and dig some more. But we are at the end of our time, and so will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we do thank you that you are the same yesterday, today, and forever. That you are still sovereign. And it might not be over kings of this world, but it's still over elections and denominations and general conferences and all of the things that you're at work in. You are sovereign, working out your will. Lord, we're just given the choice of whether we want to cooperate or not, whether we want to humble ourselves or not. And so we ask that by your Spirit you would help us to humble ourselves, that we would be obedient in the little things so that you might trust us with even greater things. And Lord, when we are weak, when we are broken in our humility, we ask that you would keep your promise, that you would raise us up from the ashes and exalt us so that your name might be glorified. Father, be with us and keep us safe and make clear to us the things that you want us to understand as we continue to read through your scriptures. We pray this all in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Again, if you're joining us online or watching on YouTube, please just throw your name into the chat or into the comments so that we kind of have an idea of how many people are joining us. And for the rest of you, I will see you all next week.